LaLaurie Mansion.
Deep within the French Quarter on the corner of Nichols and Royal Street lies the infamous LaLaurie Mansion. This architectural Frankenstein stands 3 stories high, once the highest building in the quarter, each story of the building done in a different style. Compared to its neighbors, the LaLaurie Mansion definitely stands out, both visually and historically. The house has been home to quite a few people, even Nick Cage, albeit briefly, but no one has quite left the impression as Madame Delphine LaLaurie. A woman of extremely well-to-do means, she and her third husband, Louis LaLaurie, moved into the mansion around 1831 with 2 of her daughters. Being of such high social class, it was no surprise back then that LaLaurie owned many slaves. At the time, the mansion came complete with its own slave quarters that LaLaurie wasted no time in filling. LaLaurie's place in New Orleans high society was set. She was well known for throwing lavish parties in her home. Even surrounded with upscale music and food, LaLaurie's guests were witness to her cruelty toward the slaves, toned down as her act might have been in front of them. Most that frequented these parties, however, spoke little of what they saw, afraid to offend the most gracious hostess of such fine gatherings. Also, there was a good chance that most of the elite class shared similar experiences with their own slaves. LaLaurie kept her true torturous nature hidden from the public. On occasion, however, she had been known to lose control of her personal situations, thus making them a public issue. There was an account of LaLaurie going into a fit of rage after a young slave girl pulled a bit of her hair out while brushing it. She chased the girl around the 3rd floor with a whip until in an act of desperation, the girl jumped to her death to escape the wrath of Delphine. It's almost certain that she paid off the police, as it was surprisingly easy to do at the time, especially involving your property. It wasn't until 1834, when a sudden vicious fire nearly took the whole building, that Madame LaLaurie's real passion, the experimentation torture of her slaves, came into the light of the public. The fire started in the kitchen, presumably started by one of the slaves chained to the stove. Southern Louisiana heat with no ventilation can be brutal without being attached to a stove. One can only imagine at what point it would finally break a person. In no time, the fire spread throughout the mansion. While LaLaurie desperately tried to save her precious belongings, she left all her slaves to burn to death in the inferno. The firefighters came to rescue anyone left in the building, but were refused entry into the slave quarters. But after breaking down the door, they found 7 slaves chained up by the neck, torn to pieces, yet somehow clinging to life. 2 were found with their genitals cut out and sewn onto the other's body. One woman was found in a cage, her arms and legs broken and shaped to the effect of a human crab. All the slaves, along with each unique mutilation, also had been severely beaten and emaciated. The vicious nature of these acts was so unspeakably cruel that a mob started. The swarm of people, outraged and ready to hang LaLaurie and her husband, only met with the back of a carriage. The LaLauries packed and fled quickly in the night, leaving little to no evidence of the experimentations that went on within the walls of the mansion. It is rumored that Delphine and Louis fled to Paris, never to be heard from again. Years later, Dr. Josef Mengele would dedicate some of his most gruesome experiments to the inspiration gotten from LaLaurie's lost notes. The horrors of the mansion have lived on for centuries. Tenants have come and gone, plagued with eerie accounts of moaning echoing throughout the rooms, chains rattling, and furniture being ruined by some dark, stinking liquid. Others have simply met with financial ruin. One of the tenants, a man named Jules Vigny, was found dead in 1892, locked away in a room packed with priceless belongings on a mattress that was filled with a small fortune. The locals speak of another fortune hidden somewhere in the house, but no one dared go looking for it. Some say LaLaurie's avarice has kept the treasure safe, hidden in a place only she knows about. Fast forwarding to the present, the mansion stands as a grim reminder of an ugly southern past and the corruption of wealth. Though strangely beautiful in its own way, there is a distinct sense of sadness that emanates from the house when the night touches it. On occasion, though, when the mood is right, the real tenants show themselves. Taking pictures of the house one night, I was surprised to see the lights were on. My curiosity kept me there watching. I waited to see any signs of life, a shadow pass by one of the windows. But nothing. As I watched on, I noticed a movement in my peripheral vision. The curtain in one of the bottom windows moved slightly. Walking up to the window, I heard the faintest sound coming from inside. A young woman crying, perhaps. The stories of this house ran through my mind while I pressed my ear to the window to better hear the sound. The sound faded away almost immediately, to my disappointment. I pulled away, then fell to the street in horror when I saw a pale complexion looking back at me with bright blue eyes. Her smile did nothing to comfort. It was as if I somehow fell into a trap of some sort. Running footsteps on the second-floor balcony made me look up, only to see the light on the balcony was off now. The darkness set a panic in me, and I scrambled to my feet. The face was gone from the window, and the curtain back in place. "See?" I nervously reassured myself. "Nothing to be scared of at all." "That's right. Nothing at all," a woman's voice called from the second floor. Shocked anyone was around to hear me, I looked up to catch a glimpse of the voice, only to see a shadow of a woman with a long layered dress. She laughed heartily as I squinted through the darkness, and then she came into focus. Her face changed into a solemn, serious expression. That's when I realized who I was looking at. In an instant, however, LaLaurie faded into the shadows completely. A cold chill came over me, having seen countless images of her in my research. Defeated by the sudden absence, I decided to take my leave of the hotel. My footsteps quickened when I heard her laughter again. LaLaurie has definitely made a lasting impression on that house on the corner of Nichols and Royal. Her wicked presence and cold expression will be with me every time I journey to New Orleans.
The Empty House on Route 666 by Darkened Pages.
Last week, I was driving down Route 11 through rural Virginia late at night. Torrential Torrential rain was pounding on my windshield, obscuring the road ahead. My wipers were working overtime just to let me see the barest amount of pavement, and I was moving slow enough that the needle of my speedometer was barely hovering past the 10. If the storm didn't let up soon, I would have to pull off to the side of the road and wait it out. I had just glanced down at the clock to see it was 12:37 in the morning when my front tires lost their grip on the asphalt. The car lurched violently to the right, and while I fought back against the inevitable spin, I felt myself quickly lose control of the vehicle. For a brief moment, terror's claws dug into my chest, and I knew that if anyone was coming up behind me on the road, they would slam into me. When my car hit the grass, I felt the tires catch, giving me hope that I was safe. But I was immediately disabused of that notion when I continued farther off the highway, and the back end of my vehicle suddenly dropped. I was jostled around in my seat, held in place only by the safety belt I was wearing, until everything was finally still. The car was angled upward, having fallen into the ditch, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't get it to move. I let out a furious curse and tried to center myself, working out in my head what I needed to do next. Reaching into my jacket pocket, I fished my phone out to call for help, but I couldn't get a signal. Wishing I'd brought a raincoat instead of my tiny travel umbrella, I grabbed it and stepped out of the car, bracing myself against nature's tirade as the storm beat the flimsy covering of my umbrella unrelentingly. Through the thick sheet of rain, I could just make out the shape of a house down a side street across the highway. I hurried toward it, abandoning my umbrella when I was halfway there when a strong gust of wind blew it inside out. When I got closer, the form of the house became clearer, and I hesitated before continuing. Even though the rain was pounding down upon me, seeing the old rickety structure with broken windows and an ominous visage somehow made the prospect of braving the terrible weather seem like a less dangerous choice. A teeth-rattling crack of lightning shocked the reluctance out of me, and I rushed across the overgrown yard to the house. I rapped on the door as loudly as I could, hoping my knocking could be heard over the rumbling thunder. After waiting several minutes and still getting no response, I sighed and decided to try the place next door. This house looked even shabbier than the first, but I pressed forward and pounded on the front door. Again, nothing. The same thing happened at the following 3 homes I tried. I was rapidly losing hope of finding anyone to help me. It was as if the entire street had been abandoned. When I reached the 6th house on the street, I had run out of faith that the result would be any different. I didn't bother knocking very long or with much enthusiasm, and I'd already turned to leave when I heard the sound of a wood creaking behind me. Whirling back around, I peered into complete darkness, seeing no one there. Hesitantly, I pushed the door open farther, which happened to be open, and called out to whomever might be lurking in the inky blackness of the house.
"Hello? Anybody there?"
I received no answer, so I tried again, this time louder.
"Hello? I'm coming inside. I was in an accident, and I need to use your phone."
Out of the shadows, a pair of yellow, luminescent eyes appeared. A figure's dark silhouette slowly surfaced from the lightless sea, looming large in the claustrophobic room. It looked like the thing was hunched over, yet its head was still touching the ceiling. A raspy laugh escaped its throat, and I could see a set of sharp, jagged teeth in its slobbering maw.
"These are dangerous roads,"
the creature said, its voice deep and growling. I could feel it reverberating in my skull, as if bugs had bored their way into my brain.
"Come inside. Come." I can help you.
But I couldn't move. Those monstrous eyes kept me pinned motionless, and like a coiled rattlesnake, I feared that if I stirred, it would pounce. When I finally found my voice, it was breathless and quavering.
I think I'll be okay.
The creature cackled and replied,
Oh, I don't think you will be.
Adrenaline pumped through my veins, overtaking my terror and releasing me from the horrid thing's spell. I made a mad dash for the front door, but it slammed shut when I was just inches away from freedom. I could smell the fresh air disappear, and my nostrils became filled with the stench of decay. The room felt heavy and oppressively hot.
You shouldn't go outside in weather like this,
the creature warned, but the threat was in its voice, not in its words. I could no longer see the outline of its form, just those glowing yellow eyes.
It's not safe.
I need to get back to my car.
I stammered fearfully. I tried to swallow, but it got caught in my throat.
Forget about your car. I'll take good care of you.
I'd unconsciously stuffed my hand into my jacket pocket, digging around for something, anything with which to defend myself. When my fingers perchance fell on my phone, I pulled it out and fumbled around on the screen until I was able to turn on its flashlight. I aimed it at the creature, and a bright beam cut through the darkness, illuminating it in a white glow.
Oh, God,
I muttered when I realized what I was looking at. The thing was disgustingly deformed, a massive heap of flesh, twisted and gnarled like the trunk of an old, dying oak tree. There were ligaments jutting out from its torso, attached to the broken, uneven floorboards that covered the room. It looked as if it was part of the house, a living, cancerous tumor. The creature recoiled when the light hit it, but it had no arms that it could use to shield itself. Instead, it seemed to retract into its pulsating body, like a turtle going inside its shell. When I spun around to reach for the door, my flashlight revealed tendrils of flesh stretching across the surface. I kicked at them as the thing behind me howled with rage, until the door finally crashed open. I burst out into the storm, never daring to look back at that house as I heard the creature's bellowing lamentations. I ran as fast as I could, breathing in the fresh air and expelling the rot from my lungs. I didn't even bother checking to make sure no cars were coming before darting across the highway to my car. I leapt into the driver's seat, slammed the door behind me, and burst into tears. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember was a loud clacking on my window. It startled me awake. For a moment, I thought the creature had somehow gotten out of that house, as those piercing yellow eyes had haunted my dreams. However, it was just a police officer standing there, bathed in flashing red, blue, and orange lights.
You okay?
The officer asked. Glancing out of the window, I saw the storm had cleared, and the stars were shimmering in the sky. I nodded and stepped out of my vehicle, noticing my hand was still shaking when I grabbed the handle.
I'm all right. Got stuck in this ditch.
I told him.
I couldn't get a signal to call for help. Yeah, there's not much out on this stretch of road,
he replied.
I tried to find a phone to use in one of those houses,
I said, nodding toward the street sign for Route 666 across the way. The officer shook his head.
Nobody's lived down there for years. Everyone just sort of left one day, and nobody moved in.
He seemed to study the abandoned street for a few moments before adding,
Probably for the best. It gives me the creeps.
My car was pulled out of the ditch and towed to the nearest garage to fix up the damage from the accident. When I finally got home, I felt an uneasiness about being in there alone. I kept picturing empty rooms with terrible creatures bursting through the floors and connecting to the walls and doors. All I wanted to do was go somewhere where people were, so I could forget about these thoughts. It was a nice day, so I decided to head into town. I figured there would be plenty of people out and about, going about their day and completely ignorant of what lay behind the walls of an empty house. Just as I was about to go out the door, I caught a whiff of something putrid. Turning around, my eyes darted across the room, but nothing looked out of the ordinary. The foul stench passed, and I chalked it up to my imagination, some leftover fear from my encounter. But I noticed a slight bulge in one of my floorboards. It had been there for years, and I'd never paid it any mind. But now, I had to wonder if something might be growing beneath my house. Every urban community has an urban legend. The ominous lore surrounding a strange house at the top of a hill, a ghost-covered bridge, or the dark woods at the edge of the city limits. Even the small, secluded farm town I spent the first 18 years of my life in had its own legend. Ours centered around the eccentric Strauss family and their even stranger daughter, Greta. I find myself unique compared to most. This, unfortunately, is because I am the first-hand witness of what so many generations whispered of behind closed doors, around the campfire, and at night to scare children. On one fateful evening, I found myself in the Strauss family home. I can say with brutal honesty that the horror I experienced on that night led to countless therapy sessions, bottles of little white pills, and a new life in a large city with the nearest farmhouse 100 miles away. I have found it best to begin telling my story by passing along the original legend the same way it was told to me by my peers. The Strauss family moved to the United States from Germany in the early 1900s and settled on a large plot of land in central Illinois. People aren't sure why they chose to leave Germany or why they decided to buy 300 acres in the middle of nowhere. We did, however, know a few things about them. They were very wealthy, self-sustaining naturally, and refused to leave their family farm. All of their food was either harvested, fished, or slaughtered. The children were homeschooled, and the deceased were laid to rest in the family cemetery. The property was littered with ominous signs written in both German and English, expressing how they very much wished to be left alone. There are more than a couple of rumors from townsfolk witnessing door-to-door salesmen walking onto the property, but never off of it. Rose Lane was the only road that ran along the Strauss' property line. It served as the looking glass for the rest of the community, allowing an opportunity of 10 seconds or so to catch a glimpse of the massive, eerie home. Over the years, the Strauss family became more and more reclusive. Months would pass without seeing a single family member. Once in a blue moon, someone would spot one of the Strauss family members wandering the property or staring at cars as they sped along Rose Lane, and it was like winning the social lottery. The most common sightings were of the mother and or father, who we simply referred to as Mr. and Mrs. Strauss. People would gather around the lucky individual who had seen them and eagerly interrogate them as to whom they saw and what odd thing they had seen them doing. The most famous Strauss, of course, was Greta. Everyone knew her name thanks to our town's gossipy postman. Greta earned the coveted title as the strangest Strauss due to her morbid choice of clothing and her frightening appearance. Greta's sightings were seldom, but always similar in their retellings. She dressed in black, and only black. Regardless of the season or time of day, Greta would be draped from head to toe in ink black-colored gowns. Even stranger, her head was always hidden beneath a dark veil of lace. No one in town had ever seen her face, not even a glimpse. Many years ago, as the story is told, Greta was working in the stables. Instead of focusing on the task at hand, she began to dance and play about as most children do. In a split second of wavered attention, she startled a young colt and was swiftly kicked in the jaw. To teach her a lesson, the elders of the Strauss family kept Greta from receiving medical attention, which in turn left her face to heal as a mangled mess of broken bones and cartilage. Growing up, my friends and I would scare one another with stories of Greta. Whenever a dead animal was found on our property, we'd say it was Greta sending a warning. Whenever we were lying in our bed at night and heard the floorboards creak, we would whisper to one another that it was Greta lurking in the shadows. Personally, I never actually had seen Greta, despite the countless trips I made down Rose Lane. I had only heard the stories. As the years passed, the Strauss sightings went from seldom to non-existent. The grass on their land grew long and unkempt, and the lights inside their homes ceased to glow in the night. Eventually, we assumed that the Strauss family had packed up and moved without notice. The bank couldn't sell the house, claiming a relative in Germany still had ownership of the property and was wiring full legal payments. I and my friends simply put the Strauss family farm out of mind until the night we decided to break in. John, Carrie, and myself were 18 at the time. We had just finished high school and would be attending different colleges in the fall. Like most guys our age, we spent the summer days and nights hanging out, drinking, and saving up what little money we could. The summer and our time together were flying by in tandem, nearly at an end, so we decided to make one last memory. The three of us were sitting on John's porch, watching the sun go down and throwing back some beers we had paid Carrie's older brother for. John ignited the conversation that would change our lives forever, and he still hasn't forgiven himself for it. He talked about how he was driving down Rose Lane earlier that morning and thought he had seen someone in the third-story window of the Strauss home. Carrie and I told him he was full of shit. We conversed and shared our theories about what we thought we had seen inside the house and what it looked like. Carrie suggested that it was full of forgotten German treasure and that we could be rich if we broke in. No one would ever know, since the Strauss family had been gone for so many years. We smiled greedily at one another. Before we knew what hit us, the alcohol and excitement had us on our feet and walking towards the Strauss farm in the twilight. As we strolled through the woods, we talked about all the things we would buy with our soon-to-be wealth. The sun had finally set as we reached the edge of the property, and it looked as though the monstrous house was glaring down upon us. We stopped for a moment as we finished the last few drops from our cans of liquid courage, and debated for a few minutes about how we should enter the home. Eventually, we concluded that the door to the back was the best option since it could not be seen from the road. The three of us shuffled as quietly as we could down the gravel path and onto the wooden porch. My heart pounded in my chest as we got closer, but my feet continued to move towards the house. We pointed our flashlights at the dirt-stained glass at the back of the door. Carrie and John silently decided that I was in charge as they prodded me forward. I grabbed the old iron doorknob, turned it, and looked back in disbelief. It was unlocked. As I pulled the creaking door open, a wave of musty air from within the house flew past us with a whine. Looking back at that moment, I wish we would have turned back and ran to John's. Instead, we crept inside the darkness of the Strauss home and shut the door behind us. We stepped into the kitchen and began rummaging through the drawers. Apart from a few broken dishes, some dusty utensils, and a couple of ancient appliances, the kitchen was virtually empty. The Strauss home wasn't living up to the horrific reputation we had collectively built up for it over the years. It was indeed old, massive, and a bit eerie, but nothing you would expect from another abandoned home. Everything seemed to be undisturbed. It was as if the Strausses had simply stopped their daily routine, packed up their few belongings, and left their home forever. The three of us then began searching through the rooms, opening drawers, moving furniture, and scouring through cabinets. Our respective alcohol buzzes and hopes of finding treasure began to fade, but as they did so, an uncomfortable feeling of dread and paranoia washed over us. We decided that this whole idea was a waste of time, and that going back to John's to smoke some weed would be a perfect end to a perfect evening. We backtracked through the home and into the kitchen towards the back door. Just as we were about to step outside into the freedom of the night, Carrie's voice broke the silence. "Guys, look at this." John and I turned and pointed our flashlights back towards Carrie, who was standing against the kitchen wall. He was running his hands along the edges. We looked at him curiously and asked him what he wanted. Just then, he pulled on one of the mounted wooden shelves and swung it open. A new entrance had appeared before us, one that we instantly knew was constructed to be secret. We adjusted our flashlights and stared at a staircase that descended into the dark depths below. The three of us knew that if there was anything of value left behind, it would be at the bottom of these stairs. Once again, John and Carrie nudged me forward as we crept down the stone staircase. The temperature dropped significantly as we reached the stone floor of the cellar. It was damp, dark, and I could hear the faint sounds of dripping water and scurrying rodents. We started our torch, exploring the outer walls, gasping with excitement as our dreams of wealth were back in full swing, as our flashlights illuminated glimmering metal and stones, jewelry, vases, paintings, swords, and coins filled numerous tables and cabinets within the cavernous room. We frantically filled our pockets and rambled on about how we would come back in the morning with our trucks for the rest of the loot. As we made our way to the far corner of the cellar, we noticed something very much that we didn't expect to see. A large wooden door. As to why it was barred from the outside with a metal rod, we had no idea, but in the moment we didn't care. If the cellar was full of valuables, then whatever lay behind the door would have to be even greater. John lifted the iron rod and set it on the ground. I pulled open the door and my stomach turned. The air was pungent with the sour smell of decay. We illuminated the room with our lights, and my brain attempted to comprehend the scene before me. Mutilated animal remains were scattered across the floor. A pile of old newspapers and rags formed a wadded-up nest in the corner. Across from the far wall was a mattress covered in torn, stained sheets that were covering a large lump. I looked to my friends as I covered my mouth and nose with my shirt, turning back to the room. I said something about leaving, just before I saw the horror in Carrie's eyes as he pointed behind me. I jolted back and pointed my flashlight towards the bed. The lump beneath the torn sheets on the bed sat up and turned towards us. Initially, my body refused to move. The figure rose from the bed with awkward twitching movements, and I heard its bones creak and wet skin smack against the stone floor. After what seemed like an eternity, I was able to move again. I stumbled backwards, falling into John and Carrie. We ran to the stairs like animals, thrashing about and knocking over everything in our path. John was the first to reach the base, and I was a few feet behind him. Carrie had fallen behind. John and I raced up the stairs towards the hidden entrance. I grabbed his shirt tail and yelled that we couldn't leave Carrie behind. Then we heard his panicked voice. He was close. We turned our flashlights downward and could see Carrie at the base of the stairs, and for a brief moment felt relief. My moment of content was ripped from me as I watched the figure appear behind Carrie. Its skeletal hand sunk its sharp claws into his face as he screamed. The beam of our flashlights highlighted the horrific scene like a spotlight on a stage. Greta's mangled, decomposing face stared at me between the torn shreds of her dark veil. Her dislocated jaw hung by a few strands of flesh, and her nose and eye socket were crushed, and her head was cocked to the side as if her neck had been broken. Even with her deformities, Greta seemed to smile at me as she pulled my screaming friend into the dark abyss of that cellar and tore into his flesh. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, search parties, and devastated parents. The Strauss property was turned into a crime scene and literally ripped apart. The police covered the hidden cellar John and I described. Unsurprisingly, they found evidence of torture and human neglect in the barred room. The only problem, however, was the lack of bodies. Carrie's remains were never seen again. The only evidence found was his flashlight and the remains of his clothes. They had been ripped apart into 100 pieces. I have a theory about Greta, that she had always been a monster, and over time she had become uncontrollable. The Strausses attempted to do what they could with her before abandoning their home. Eventually, they resorted to locking her away in a makeshift dungeon to rot. But that's the problem with the worst kind of monsters. One very important thing the Strauss family neglected to consider is that some creatures, the one urban legends are written about, refuse to die.